Welcome to the course Culturally Responsive Built Environments. Today we are going to discuss about the informal settlements, especially in Indian context, and this is where I am going to discuss about a very important contribution by Vikram Bhatt and his team. This is on how the other half builds. So in fact it has about 3 volumes, and this is actually prepared by the team of Witold and Vikram, Muhammad, Ali, Masia, Bhushan, Amir Ali, Rajendra Puri, and Nitin Raje and Patrick Reid. So it's a research paper number 9, and it's a very little old document, 1984. But why I'm bringing this dated document, but still it is relevant, whatever the illustrations they have demonstrated and whatever the conditions of slums, what they have studied in 1984, they are still existing, the prevailing conditions even in today's conditions of squatter settlements. So the first volume actually talks about space, and here in this particular lecture I am going to briefly describe about how the informal settlements and what kind of patterns they live, and in fact especially from a built environment perspective, how even small trees, how the extensions and how the public structures and how they contribute to this meanings of these informal spaces, and at the same time the workplaces, which is the most important backbone of any of these informal settlements. So what they did was they did intensive studies in some of the slums, especially in the mill areas, textile mill areas, and in Indore and Ahmedabad and a couple of areas. So there's a very vast compilation and a very detailed understanding of the intricate spaces within the informal settlements. So as I said, this how the other half builds, the whole notion of other half, it's in fact if you look at the urban population, it's almost half of the percentage or in a kind of lower income groups, and because people started migrating from villages to the towns or the urban centers, and they tend to squat in smaller settlements in the clusters. There are many reasons how they squat, and so one is sometimes the groups keep coming over as a construction laborers, as an informal sectors, working sectors like carpenters, yarning, and if it is a textile, obviously there's some kind of livelihoods, and people selling vegetables, people doing carpentry, so there are a variety of livelihood segments who come along and who try to squat in the urban centers. But now you can see many of the studies, they see the squatter settlements, informal settlements, as a problem to the cities. But in the very introduction of this book, what they talk about as a solution, how the informal settlements offers a solution for the migrants coming over, and where they can conduct their livelihood, where they can conduct their dailyhood activities in a very limited space and in a much more informal way of doing things, and at the same time in a more of to some extent in a kind of secured environments within their own homogenized clusters. So he discussed about, in the first volume 1, what the authors have discussed is various segments of the built form segments, and especially how they have derived, how they have framed the meanings, and how these places are performed in variety of timings, variety of groups of people, and it's not only the built environment, how the natural landscape like trees, how they frame the activity patterns, right, and how they support the built forms within it. So the very first aspect which they looked at is called house extensions. How the dwellings have got a little extensions. The very first extension which they talks about, the stoops. It is the simplest and the smallest of extensions, and usually the stoops, the size of the stoop is constrained with the width of the street and the type of the traffic. So sometimes it is hardly about a 1 meter up to 1 meter, and it's a kind of small extension in the front of the house frames, where you have a kind of stone material. They use the material of stone, or it could be a small wattle and daub construction of a small extension, or any other informal materials. So you can see here of the extensions at 2 levels, So you have a small extension outside. Sometimes how these places, you can see even on the next to the nala, they can keep a small stone slab, and that itself could be a kind of even a cooking place or a washing place, or even a small sitting and working place. So it's a small area. Even someone can sit and make a cigarettes and beads. And here you can see they can even park the bicycle, and they can go to the top level of it with a ladder, right? And so which means people can even filter the grains or rice or something like that. They can filter the atta, which is the wheat powder. So the second aspect of these house extensions is a kind of platforms. So you have here, the kind of platforms. It could be normally a kind of very rough stone based, or sometimes it could have been a little concrete elevated, or it could be a wattle and daub. Like what you can see here is a kind of a 2-level extension. So on one side they have a sleeping space, and one side they have either washing space or a cooking space kind of thing. And similarly you have the raised platform, where sometimes with the nature of the tree settings, sometimes you have a tree setting under the shade, how they can make a small raised platform which they might use for cooking or washing. And this is again a stone pavement, and this is a kind of platforms. In Gujarat, they used to call it a kind of otla kind of thing. So similarly you have a kind of wash places, parking a bicycle onto the next wall. So like that there are many purposes. Sometimes if he was a kind of owner of a push cart, so obviously if the street is very narrow, so what they do was they try to incline it, and they put it in the wall so that it don't obstruct the street as well. So this is a kind of nature of so why this informal way of, it's not like in any of the dwellings. So sometimes you have a recession here, so obviously they might plan for keeping some cart or keeping a bicycle, or that is how the nature of form have eventually have derived. So you can see the kind of platforms. Imagine a husband is working, let's say if he's a maker of all these iron equipments, metal equipments, obviously he needs a little fire and charcoal. On one side he will be making these livelihood activities. On the other side the woman will be sitting, and his bicycle is there, and there's a small cot. So this is how a setup is, and they have a kind of low height roofs. And so if you look at it, the most of the activities do happen much of the outside, the informal way, rather than the inside. Inside is much more used for the sleeping purposes, especially in terms of rain or in the night times. But much of their livelihood, the living patterns occurs mostly in the outside of it, that is in a more informal way, in a shared spaces. And similarly you have the porches. So you can see how the porches, they have a small seating spaces, and depending on the width of the street, so sometimes it is covered, the front of it is a little covered, and they have the porches. It's a kind of veranda sort of thing. So even these models do exist, and again multiple activities do take place. So here you have a wash places. So half of it is a kind of wash place, and half of it is a kind of there's any other circulation patterns. So drying the clothes, and where you can see of a high platform. So you can see a high platform and how they dry the clothes and how they conduct, how they keep their drinking water pots, and this is a kind of activities. And if the same porches, if you look at how the street of porches appear, if you look at the plan and the section of it, so you have these porches interacting with each other. And in fact, if you see a porch here and a porch here, so people keep interacting, and there's a very informal one is parking a cycle, and the children are playing here. So there is the visual aspect of it. So even if children are playing around and the woman is conducting some activity outside, the washing or cooking, and the man is doing a yarning. So let's say if there's a yarning community and they need a whole street length, obviously, to do that. So obviously there's a livelihood activity goes on across it. And similarly, the children keeps playing. There's a vegetable vendor who comes in within it. There's a lot of informal activity, and there's a good community. The visual and physical communication happens between the permeable actions of it, which actually interacts from both from the front to front, and the street is more of a living space. So here again you have this kind of outdoor rooms. So in many of the cases what they do is if there's a tree or they try to extend a small room for themselves, and it could be a semi-open, or so what you can see is the cart is being vertically placed, right, so that they get more space into it. So one thing what as an architectural students I always advise for the students to understand the informal sector. The very small unit, I used to ask the students to survey the anthropometrical dimensions of a small pawn shop, because a person is sitting and within 1 meter to 1 meter everything is accessible. He do pawns, he do sell cigarettes, he do has his save the money and put the money, and he have his lunch part of it, and at the same time he closes everything. So which means in a small 1 meter by 1 meter space, in 1 cubic meter space, everything happens, right? So that is one thing one has to learn, how space is utilized in an effective way. And if especially if someone who is, we call it as a kind of dada, a kind of leader of that particular group or a particular slum. So obviously many of them, they have a kind of private yards. So where, and here you can see on the back side of the rivers how they have a kind of private yards, and especially if it is near the river, obviously there are many at the times they get the flood water comes in and they disturb. So obviously they raise the platforms, they raise them in the piles, and then they have a kind of private yard sort of thing. So this is a little the luxurious model of the informal sector, where not only it is a private aspect of it, even if it is they have a small temple or something like that, and people come over and in the nearby houses and they worship. So in that way, that yard is more or less a kind of both acts as a private and as well as a semi-public areas. So what the team has worked into is, because how this informal sector, the way we learn in architecture, and the variety of, because we only if you look at the time saver standards or anything like that, how we sit, how we stand, how we sit on a commode, how the wheelchair, most of these activities have been documented. But if you look at the ergonomics of it, how the informal livelihoods are conducted, like for instance, if you look at the 4 to 5 women who are conducting kind of sorting out the grains or any other toy making. So obviously what kind of spaces you need, right? And imagine how you are dressing a baby, and how you are putting on a sari, right? How you are giving a comfort to the child, right? And how you are bathing an infant, right? So obviously how someone is making a chowki, how they are pressing the rice. So in that way, all these anthropometrical details have been measured and documented, because this is very important to understand how much space is needed for what purpose, and on a wholesome, how much is a kind of shared space, how much is a kind of multifunctional spaces, and how much is more for the private spaces. So on a volumetric analysis, so how much a household should get a space. So this all will help someone to get how much space is required for whom. So the second aspect, what this volume 1 has covered is the workplaces, the informal workplaces. So in fact, in many of the slums which I personally have visited, at least from my understanding, I have seen a variety of livelihoods. I'm just showing a few what has been illustrated in the book, but these are very quite common. I have seen even the much more educated class also living in the slums. The people who had even post graduations also lived in the slums, still doing some informal activities. And if we are talking about 1984 time, obviously the education was also very less, mostly the workforce who migrated from rural areas, and how, like, in fact, the women plays an important role, like how they roll out the BDs or the cigarettes, the tobacco rollings. And in fact, in some slums, I even heard about if they do about 200 cigarettes or 200 BDs, they get hardly 5 rupees or 10 rupees. So that is the kind of income rate, the amount of effort you keep it. And not only that, how I have come across people who roll the cotton, we call it as battis, and where we put the lamps for the temples and in our puja worship areas. So people make 100, 200, 300 and hardly they get 20 rupees or 30 rupees. So, so that kind of exploitation happens. And then there are other aspects, people who are making toys, people who can make carpentry, But if you look at the carpentry, what kind of space he needs? He needs to stock some wood, right? And he needs to a workplace where he can cut the wood, polish a small polish bench, where he can seesaw it, right? And at the same time where he can put the wood coating. So obviously it is not about a uniform family, a uniform size, but if you talk about the livelihood of it, the space requirement is much more beyond it. And the same thing, how he works in the daytime and how the whole space turns into the night time. And similarly, the awnings work, how the whole awning work and how 3-4 people sit together and how they awn it and what kind of space they need. They need a much more lengthier space, and what kind of house pattern it work, right? So what you see here is a kind of what kind of spread, So the same layout, but if you look at the carpentry work, so much of his work happens on much more outside, right? And imagine in a rainy season how he stored the wood. So obviously a small extension or something like that would help him to stack the wood. And similarly, there are other livelihoods like the garbage pickers, and especially to have how they stack the garbage, and at the same time where do they sleep, where do they eat. It was really, if you look at the details of it, if someone spends the time how actually the functions, it's really amazing to see in such a heap of garbage collection how they filter them into all the plastic bottles into one bag, and how the plastic and how the gunny bags, how they lay it and how tightly they pack it, how they stack it. So one need to understand, if you are an architecture student, one need to be with them and understand really what kind of space they need and what kind of space it is performed. And similarly the sandal, the sandal, you have got the rubber sandals. What they do is they get the rubber sheets, because they need, or sometimes different sheets, and they cut down and they need some greaves and they need some tools to do it. And after that they need to have a display if they are sending it to the nearby market. So obviously they need some small rickshaw or something like that which will come to that place and pick all these things and take it to the nearby market. So when we're talking about, it's not only the production of that particular sandal or any toy or any window or a carpentry work, but it is also talks about the delivery of it, delivery of goods for making them in the site, and delivery and taking them out to the market. So obviously the street functions an important role. The width of the street also plays an important role. And the rope braiding, how, because if you look at the rope braiding, obviously you need a length, right? So the whole length of what you can see here is the two people onto the other side, and then they tension the wire and they keep rolling it. So in that way they swindle around and make the rope. And similarly for the sari, the making of the saris, how a length of saris are made, right? So for every section, what they did was they kind of summarized the. I'm just showing a small sample of it, but there's an extension to it. So for instance, if you're talking about bracelets making, you have the total area in 2 square meter, and workspace you have 2 square, which could be done in a public or open, and it could be interior also. And similarly, whether required or energy required. Like for example, if you say the metal work, the lace making or anything like that, and then you need kind of fire. And whereas the bread, if someone is making the bread, obviously they need a gas, and it could be interior. And whereas if you look at the brooms, it could be even exterior also, right? So like that, they have understood the kind of area requirement for and then you have the bread making, you need the type of oven you need, and the type of charcoal you need for baking it, and how you can dry it up, what kind of spaces you need. So on that note, you need a kind of 6 square meter, right? So this is a kind of summary of understanding of different. I'm sure even today they're more or less valid of similar lines. So the third aspect which they discussed was shops. And shops basically are kind of two types, what you commonly find. One is attached to the living spaces, and the second one is detached to the living spaces. So the attached is living spaces, it could be a small vegetable, like the woman just outside her extension, she can even sell the vegetables. On every corner of a house, every corner of a street, obviously you might have a small shop. It may be attached or it may be detached, right? And a cycle shop. So how sometimes they give cycles for rent, right? For 1 hour, you have 1 hour, for 1 hour this much they charge, and they do repair and air filling. Sometimes it's a scooter station also. So like that, what kind of spaces you need for parking the rented cycles, the air filling machine, and the repair shop, and if there is a puncture or everything, and if the people who are coming, if they want to sit there. So obviously this all requires for a specific needs for different types of livelihoods. And then if one is mapping down the slums, like what if you look at these legend, where the grocery shop, so which means there's a bicycle shop, there's a grocery shop, there's a milk, there's an ironing center. There's a variety of livelihoods across the streets, and where the corners, so you can see that a variety of places have been, like you can have the milk booth here, and you have the groceries, small places, small clusters. So in that way, what they did was like kind of for ironing, what is the size you required, that is actually conducted, and basically the location and some of the observations, right? So this kind of mapping has been done. And the fourth aspect which they talked about is the trees, which is a natural features. And as an architect, which we train is a kind of natural site, how you understand the topography, the vegetation available. So similarly, what they did was how these trees also makes a tree places, places to conduct their political activities, their social activities, their religious activities, their domestic activities. So in fact, it also depends on the nature of the tree and location of the tree, where it is. So in fact, if you look at and what kind of spread it is, like if you talk about the spread, obviously it's a large tree space where a number of activities do take place. Sometimes a group of families, it could be in a small neighborhood cluster, and then you conduct a variety of lives. And obviously it is, if you look at you need to build a small platform of it. It is advisable to build a small platform where people can sit over and even do some kind of informal activities. And it depends on the kind of nature of tree and the spread. If it is a people tree, obviously in many cases you see a kind of temple or a religious association. And it's also to do with the biological reasons of the tree, how what time of it, how it takes out the oxygen and the carbon dioxide, and in the afternoon what tree shade, because what kind of canopy it had, right? So what they did was they actually documented the variety of trees. So this is where the landscape dimension of informal settlements, and if you look at the maturity period, and if you look at the kind of summary of what the trees and the nature of it, like the banyan tree, it has a 20 years of maturity period, and the height can go till 30 meters plus, and it kind of umbrella, whereas in casuarina you have a kind of conical, and you have the palmaria, and whereas the peepal tree, which is much more of a irregular tree, right? So like that, the nature of trees, and at the same time they also categorize with the type of shading trees, the flowering trees, and the fruits, right? Because the fruits are also talks about the kind of how it can offer the people fruits, and it can serve the food purposes. The flowering, it talks about the aesthetic purposes as well, and similarly the shade, which actually supports the activity of it. So if you look at this kind of summary, how they classify is a kind of, if it's a large tree, it have, normally if you look at the public spaces, the public square should be less than, I'm just underlining this, should not be less than 10 meters and not more than 20 meters. So that, because this particular place below the tree without interfering the traffic around the perimeter. And so normally he also specified what type of trees are most suitable, the banyan, peepal, and the gulmohar and rain tree, like that. So the nature of trees and the nature of spaces could also be associated within it, and the species of the trees as well. Similarly, you have the major street widening, which can create a 3 to 5 meter space beside the main circulation. And what are the species it is available? Again, you have the Trimeda, peepal, neem, jacaranda, copperpot, fig, almond. So similarly, the minor street widening, because we are talking about 2 to 3 meter here of a minor street widening, and again here you have these has to be trimmed annually to prevent them from encroaching on the road right of it, because sometimes some of the trees keep encroaching. So that is where the regular maintenance needed, annual maintenance. And the streets, if the streets are less than 5 meters wide, then they can be planted along the side, and obviously it could be made in the kind of alternate way of it, so that in continuous, when you are walking, if it is a 5 meter, obviously it can give you a continuous shade as well. And what they have also recommended is care must be taken to ensure the foliage begins at least 3 meters above the ground, and trees with tall trunks are suitable for streets, like so that the foliage should start above 3 meters, because it should not obstruct the street and the movements. And similarly, you have the private courtyards, and both at the front and the rear courtyards. And whereas the front courtyards, if it is facing the street and at least 5 meters square, are sufficiently large to accommodate fruit trees such as mango, drumstick, chiku. So which means it can be used for the domestic purposes. And apart from it, you can also think of some small shrubs and plants which can be vegetables, leafy vegetables. The other aspect which they discussed is the public structures. So in the whole slums, wherever you go, one of the common type of public structures, as I discussed with the tree shades and the squares, public squares, we also see the kind of open taps, or where people do collect water, drinking water, bathing activities, and that is where you can see a kind of standpipes. Stand where it could be a municipal connection, or it could be illegal connections which they bring about from, and that is how people stand in queues. In fact, in these kind of standpipe and these nalla places where one can observe, there are two things. One is a place of interaction, at the same time a place of many hurdles. People, sometimes you can see many fights among the women who doesn't stand in the queue, and in that way the society actually frames themselves. These are the spaces which offer some kind of interaction. So and that is where one needs a kind of discipline, how we conduct these places. And Apart from that, you also, based on the nature of the trees and the position of the trees and the square compositions, you have the small temple places, and within the temple places next to it you have kind of offers livelihood places. So one can look at it as a kind of community complex where different actors, on one side you have the religious temple, on one side you have the religious temple, one side you have the livelihood activity. So there's a variety of activities, people coming together and the framing the places. So in a settlement, if you look at it, if where the standpipes are, where the temple is, where the school is, there's a variety. But in a regular layout, what you see is they assign everything here, and that is what so there's no much of interaction between. But here, whereas in informal settlements, you can see a blend of diversity of spaces and richness. In some places where they're very small, there much rich activities do happen. So even in these vehicles, when we talk about vehicles, because apart from what you conduct in your open spaces and the semi-open spaces and the closed spaces, these vehicles also you have to do an kind of ergonomical aspects of how much space it needs when you tilt it, how much space it needs, and when you take it over, and how much space it needs when it opens up at a shutter, right? So how a small box can make a big shop, right? So these are all the anthropometrical details one has to look at it. And the streets, how the street offers. So you have the main streets, narrow lanes and alleys. And so if you see the main streets, you are talking about 3 meters. And whereas you have the narrow lanes, which is about 1.5 to 3 meters. And the alleyways, which is smaller one, which is up to 1.5 meters, so which could be just a small pedestrian routes, because the small routes which, and then how they mapped out, if you look at the main streets, you have these segments, and whereas you have the narrow lanes, and you have small alleyways here and there, small alleyways here and there, that is how the mapping has been done. And you look at calculate the percentage of these, and that is how one can understand these places. And now when we talk about the width of it, so what vehicles could be allowed inside, and based on the livelihood activities, imagine someone is making a huge amount of toys or the sandals, and he has to shift. So how his position of his house should be, because a vehicle has to transport it. Otherwise, he has to take the luggage and go out and put it in somewhere else, and again the vehicle comes there. So there's a various set of arrangements which one has to think about while planning for settling the informal settlements. And apart from that, the kind of service infrastructures. So this is how a brief discussion of how the other half builds. Basically we discussed about these 4-5 dimensions of it, the extensions into it, the house extensions, the workplaces, we talked about the shops, we talked about the trees, and we talked about the public structures, and very commonly associated problems. So one is where we talk about, this is about the poor consideration of cultural and social factors. So in fact, here, if we are talking about, when we talk about the religion, when we talk about the way they are conducted and the kind of spaces they need, so that is where here if you see, the current planning methods emphasize economic efficiency in site layout by optimizing variables such as plot ratios and road widths, but have less successful in responding to the cultural and social factors. So what they thought was, when in any of the slum development programs, they come to a kind of, with various mathematical models, with calculations, they come to a kind of uniform and standardized models. For a household size of this, you need this much of size of plot. The plot maybe in fact I discussed with you in the disaster recovery also, they come with a kind of 3 to 5 cents of land, and then how the core dwelling unit concept have been started developing, but in reality how one modifies according to the socio-cultural patterns and his way of living is very important. Now in these development processes, they don't address the kind of cultural and social factors in an effective way. And mostly it was observed that 90% of the occupants in Ahmedabad study areas, whatever they have been given, they have modified it, right? So because these models doesn't sufficiently address the livelihood requirements, the anthropometrical requirements, the ergonomical aspects of it, and the visual aspects of the design aspects of it. It takes back to the urban design aspects of the responsive environments of permeability, the legibility, and the safety aspect of it, the security aspect of it. Then the second aspect which they talk about, the poor quality and variety of open spaces. So in the most housing schemes, the public open spaces, they lack diversity and richness. Because why? The informal, though they are in a small in scale, but the activities that happen is much more in a rich, and it is much more lively, because sometimes, as I said, it is a shared space, it is a collaborative space, one person, and it also gives a sense of security, how your house front is visually oriented to the street, or where the child is playing, where your market is happening, where you are selling your products, where you are transporting your things, right? So this is where that variety and richness, again it brings back to urban design aspect of it. And incorrect assumptions concerning family income and plot sizes. So normally in those times they were talking about 700 per month for EWS, economically weaker sections, and the lower income group, and the middle income group, and the higher income group. Based on the income, they decided on the sizes of it, right? So, but if you are talking about a lower income group or a EWS, imagine a monkey player, he might need only a place for his monkey and a small house. But the same person who is a carpenter or a potter, he needs a little bigger space for where he makes the pots, right? So where someone selling only the vegetables, they need a different space for it. So that is where we have, it's not about the income, the correlation between the income and the physical plot characteristics. It has to look at how it is functioned. Lack of variety of plot sizes. Again, here if you look at it, it is assumed that if two families earn the same amount of money, their spatial requirements should be the same. Thus, the plot sizes within each income category in typical sites and service projects are kept uniform. So that is where, as I just explained to you, based on the livelihood activities, it varies quite a lot, right? And the provision of multifamily plots, right? So in fact, when we are talking about a large percentage of plots in informal contain more than one family. If you are talking about any Muslim families, you might sometimes a household size will be even more than 10, 15 also. But then it is a group of families living together. So one has to think about how these families live together, and how they can still have the kind of shared livelihood activities and as well as spaces. So that is one thing. And how a family grows in time. That is one aspect, that is where the family and time aspect has to look at it. And the blind process of plot allocation, even in the new settlement. So what they do is how they take a lottery methods and how they allocate the random draw, and in that process no one knows where they are getting the house, and no one knows, because of uniform and standardized models, what kind of house he is getting, what kind of locality he is getting, and what front yard he is getting, what backyard he is getting, and how he can conduct them. So that is where the consultation process is very much important. And this we have also discussed in sometimes Bihari can get an adjacent to someone from Rajasthan or Chhattisgarh. Obviously there might be some ethnic differences, and the way their social performatives are conducted and how they clash each other. There are various aspects one has to look at it. It is beyond the livelihood. We have to take back into how the ethnicity and the religious aspects are also frames the allocation process. And here I'll end this session, so you get an idea of how this is conducted. So in the following session, I'll show you a good example of how not to relocate slums. Thank you.